Welcome to Taiwan Talks, bringing you a Taiwan perspective on global affairs. I'm Albert Cho. Today, we dive into the shifting dynamics of international relations. While the threat of a nuclear conflict has subsided, the focus has shifted to economic competition. Taiwan finds itself at a crossroad from forging bilateral trade agreements to CPTPP membership, with this chip race taking center stage as TSMC faces off against Samsung's ambitious investment with over $230 billion in 5 new foundries. We explore Taiwan's heavy reliance on the chip industry and the need for diversification. Joining us are Marco Metzger, Numanda Executive Vice President and Memphis Electronic President. Dennis Ong, Sam Houston State University Political Science Associate Professor, and Dylan Patel, Chief Analyst at Semi Analysis. Very warm welcome on the show, three of you. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, the first question I would like to begin with Marco. So there have been a number of disputes since TSMC opened its factories in the U.S. last year. From U.S. demands in sharing excess profits to requesting confidential information about a new factory. So what are some of the challenges that you think TSMC is currently facing in the United States?
I think one of the biggest challenge they are facing there is probably also the search for talents. Mm-hmm. You know, I think to run the fabs how they run it here in Taiwan will be a big challenge, because it's not only TSMC who is building up new fabs in the USA. There's a lot of other companies who are doing this also. And I think the electrical engineering graduates are probably on the same level than Taiwan, but Taiwan is much smaller than the US. So to keep up this level of depth for the technology, for the yield rate, there will be some time to adjust this. And I think TSMC has sent over a lot of people who basically help to ramp up the fab, but ultimately they also need to hire local people there, and they need to find them and keep them.
Well, and also the salary structure in the States and also in Taiwan are different. I mean, do you have any observation of that?
Yes, they are definitely on a different level, but I think for people here in Taiwan to work for TSMC is also kind of like an honor, right? Yeah. So you're working for the biggest company kind of in the semiconductor, in the foundry business. So the people here are very dedicated. So for example, if there's any challenge at night and the manager calls and say, okay, you need to come to the line, they are coming. There's no question asked. It's a little bit a different working culture. I think not only the US, probably also in Europe, how to do this. So Taiwan has a very special workforce, high discipline, and this is exactly what you need in semiconductor manufacturing.
Okay, good. All right, so Dylan, what's your observation of the same question?
The most interesting thing that I noticed when I drove and biked all around Hsinchu TSMC last weekend, and the most interesting observation I noticed was certain chemicals in the US, we have to bring them over on trucks. In Taiwan, they're pumped right into the facility. The ecosystem is actually already built, whereas in Arizona for TSMC, for Intel, while some of it is being built, there's a significant amount of other investment beyond just what TSMC is doing, just what Intel is doing. All these partners need to move there. And so that is one of the biggest challenges is can that infrastructure be built up? And it's not just the employees in the fab, it's hundreds and thousands of engineers that work around it at other companies, at the supply chain.
Okay, speaking of the U.S. demands on TSMC's new factory, Dennis, I wonder, do you think that the U.S. demands on TSMC, I think you think it's a fair game, or you think it's like too much burden, put on TSMC?
Well, it's hard to say whether it's fair or not, because geographically speaking, the TSMC now certainly become more important to the whole world. So especially after COVID-19, the whole world kind of realized that cheap production is mainly from the Asia, particularly in Taiwan. So from the U.S. perspective, definitely if the U.S. can secure the chip supply in the country domestically, that will be good for them. So from U.S. perspective, it is a fair game. However, from Taiwan's perspective, it's probably a different story. So how Taiwan can protect their own interests, how TSMC can maintain the situation where everyone still relies on Taiwan, relies on TSMC's high-tech production. That's what TSMC or probably the Taiwan government need to do. But if that's a fair game, I would say from U.S. National interest, it is a fair game to the U.S. and it is a fair game if the TSMC know how to secure their interests, find a way.
Well, actually, companies like TSMC not only need to face the challenges from the domestic America, but also face the challenges from companies from South Korea. Samsung is one of them, right? When the President Yoon, when he visited White House, actually he wanted to make some kind of ambitious kind of plan to attract a lot of U.S. companies to invest in South Korea. So that's actually kind of bring our attention from the domestic America to overseas, right? So you have anything to say if TSMC any kind of strategy it can adapt to counter the companies kind of challenge from companies like Samsung? Marco, maybe you first.
Well, I think if you look just from a business perspective, I think Samsung foundry business or revenue is probably a fourth of what TSMC is doing. TSMC is owning around about 60% market share in the foundry business. And I think in terms of technology, they have proven all the different shrinks to be quite efficient and successful. So Samsung had huge issues 2 years ago, 1.5 years ago, where they're going to 4 nanometer, where they're losing customers, where they have been before exclusive with Samsung, now going to TSMC. So I think there are two parts where we need to understand. TSMC is a very well-oiled machine with the top IC design companies as customers, like NVIDIA, AMD, Apple. I mean, in such an ecosystem, they are learning also more and more how to use the manufacturing process. But also, for example, what is probably the new thing is the advanced packaging, chiplets, and all of this, where I think they have a few years like advance, I would say. I think it's not so easy for Koreans to really come in. And let's understand, Samsung is more kind of a memory company, right? It's like DRAM and NAND. They also basically, it's like with Intel, who is also foundry, they have their customers are also somehow competitors. TSMC is pure play foundry. They build for you, they make for you, they are not competing with you. And I think, I definitely would believe if they continue like this, they have several years like a front run where they will keep this lead also.
Dylan, do you agree with him?
Absolutely. And it's not just, hey, who gets to 3 nanometer, 2 nanometer first. TSMC is also looking beyond that at specialty technologies. So if we look at the foundry in Japan, that they have a joint venture, they're actually teaming up with Sony and many of the Japanese automotive companies. And Sony, of course, has the best CMOS image sensors in the world. And so now TSMC is partnering with Sony and is going to bring that capability within their border. You know, there's the discussion about the joint venture in Germany. It would be similar for power electronics, for MEMS technologies, these specialty technologies that TSMC is not the leader in yet, but they're reaching out and saying, hey, we are the best at manufacturing, improving yield. Let's partner with the people who have the technology and let's bring it together and make it our foundry offering.
We are also interested in the role of Japan. So this question goes to Dennis. Japan's Prime Minister Fumio Kishida recently invited TSMC, Samsung, Intel, Micron, and other semiconductors companies, giants, for discussion aimed at strengthening Japan's semiconductor supply chain. So, you know, what's Japan's strategy in this?
Well, Japan's strategy from national interest perspective, again, well, having all those advanced technology company to Japan is definitely good for them. You know, in combination of all the different tech company that Japan can produce, whatever they like. I totally agree with Marco and Dylan. They just mentioned why there's a reason why TSMC is unique, because they specialize very specific, very unique. Create an ecosystem that other company may not compete. You know, we are ahead of other competitor many years, at least so far. So TSMC has a strength to negotiate, to counter any kind of offer, counter any kind of in any kind of negotiation. That's the strength of TSMC. But Albert, you just mentioned Japan, South Korea. The government can pay attention to this, right? But what we heard is TSMC. We're not hear any like a Taiwanese government get involved. I think TSMC need to get more support from the government. I think that's very important. I think Marco and Dylan just mentioned how strong our, in Taiwan, the TSMC or other technology company, they did everything they could, and achieve certain achievement. But now they probably need to have some push and some support from the government, just like Japan and Korea.
Well, I mean, I'm still wondering, kind of come back to the advantage, and also, I'm more concerned with the potential weakness with TSMC. It looks like, according to your observation and also very professional analysis, it's such that TSMC is still, ahead of Samsung. But any kind of potential, concern TSMC should have in order to, keep its leading status, maybe Delin?
With TSMC ahead for the last few years, beating Samsung, beating Intel, both of those companies have started employing strategies of trying to race forward to the next technology. And this is much higher risk, of course, going to gate-all-around transistors, to backside power delivery networks. These are technologies that would be transformative, and Samsung and Intel are both trying to put them into production before TSMC wants to. And so the risk is, of course, hey, this is a high-risk strategy. Intel and Samsung, most likely do not make it, but if they do, they would jump ahead of TSMC, in fact. And so that is a big risk.
Okay, Marco. Any suggestion for TSMC?
Right. So, I can agree what Dylan mentioned, but to counter this is like when you have like these big demand from these IC design companies, right, who are on the leading edge. I mean, if you have an Apple as a customer, they are also putting a lot of pressure on technology, what you can do. And there you can improve like yield pretty good because you have very high volume, right? So I think semiconductor production is very important also about the yield, not only how much you produce. If I make 100 chips and 65 fail, it's not good for our IC design house. And so that's what I meant in the opening answer to the question, is like TSMC has, through these high volume customers, a lot of experience on different application. And to Dylan's point, I think Japan with the CMOS sensors, for example, Europe with power, with MEMS, USA with AI chips. So you have everywhere in every region where TSMC is going. So they are getting more into the regional ecosystem, and they are making more connections outside of Taiwan, which I think is a very good step, because TSMC is known as a quite secretive company, I would say, right? They're normally not so open, but I think with going into the other countries with a clear strategy, I'm pretty impressed how they play this, how they do this. And ultimately, I think in Taiwan, I would not worry so much, because when we talk about volumes, is millions of wafers what TSMC is producing here in Taiwan, comparing to maybe 600,000 wafers in the US. So the US or the US customers will never be able, for example, for a customer like Apple to produce everything in USA. It's just not possible. You have so many fabs here, they have been built up since 20, 30 years. So I think there's really like a strong value where TSMC, from my perspective, still remains also very strong locally in Taiwan, but also from a technology.
Right. To put this in a very colloquial way, do you think how many years does TSMC still can get ahead, as opposed to the second company, Samsung? You think?
I would say at least five years,
5
if not
years?
even 10 years.
Or even 10 years. Dennis?
Well, I like to I agree with you. From the technology perspective, I think TSMC is leading in 5 to 10 years is fine. But the concern is when TSMC actually get connect to like Japan, Korea, and the US. We've already heard learned the news from Arizona, the brain drain issue, right? People get to Arizona, they learn, the working environment is a whole new world to the employees, from Taiwan. So the technicians from Taiwan, they may just switch company after several years. I think the brain drain issue will be a concern for TSMC. It's definitely a different working environment. I think that TSMC can definitely improve their working environment, the benefit, the salary, the working environment. Those things is something for TSMC to concern and to fix it. But technological wise, I think TSMC, the ecosystem they build is very unique, and it's hard to mimic or copy.
Yeah, I think Dennis raised excellent points. The working culture in Asia is very different from the working culture in the States. And whenever the TSMC engineers they work in Arizona, they might be like attracted to other companies. That's one possibility. And what about you, Dylan? Still the same questions. Do you think that how many years do you think that TSMC still can get ahead?
So TSMC will be ahead technologically for at least 2 years, but that doesn't mean that they're not going to be the biggest foundry in the world. In fact, they'll remain that for the rest of the decade at minimum, because the true strength of TSMC is not, hey, we get to the technology first. They have done that. That's how they've gotten the lead. But really the true strength is we can go from no production to millions of chips, hundreds of millions of chips in 6 months. They do this for Apple every few years, and it's amazing. Intel, Samsung, they've never been able to do that.
Right. According to Counterpoint's research, TSMC's share of the global semiconductor or market soared to 60% in the fourth quarter of last year, astounding 4.6 times of Samsung's 13%. However, given tensions between the United States, Taiwan, and China, could Samsung possibly outpace TSMC? If so, when would this shift likely start? So the next question would be goes to Dennis. So let's come back to the Japan's role in this. We talked about Kishida's his invitation to TSMC. So maybe Japan's company is not like the Samsung, the Korean company. So would you kind of analyze the companies in Japan in the semiconductor area? What's the strength and weakness in Japan?
Well, like we all discussed earlier, I think the TSMC, the strength of TSMC is not about technology advance. Well, maybe now is the advance for a couple of years, but the whole ecosystem they build is just amazing. Is unprecedented. So TSMC, in comparison to company in Japan, company in South Korea, the TSMC has its strengths. In Japan, definitely I would say Japan like to learn from the TSMC. But the better way to learn from TSMC probably at this moment is work with them, collaborate with them. That's the reason why the Prime Minister of Japan actually tried to bring TSMC in Japan instead of try to outpace TSMC. It's very difficult.
What about you, Dylan, the Japanese semiconductor companies?
Japan is extremely strong in equipment and the chemical supply chain, and so they collaborate heavily with TSMC, and this is a collaboration that's strengthening actually. On the other hand, Japan is not sticking everything that they have on TSMC. In fact, they're trying to start their own foundry called Rapidus. They're taking experts from the equipment industry and investing tens of billions of dollars into this, and they want to do 2 nanometer by the end of the decade. So they want to have their own foundry as well. And so it's there is a strong friendship that is developing, but there is also the hope that they can have their own domestic foundry industry.
After talking about the Taiwanese semiconductor company and also its developments in the United States, now we shift our topic to the U.S. Taiwan Initiative on the 21st century trade. Many see it as the most significant trade agreement since Taiwan and U.S. cut diplomatic ties since 1979. So my first question goes to Marco. Incentivize Taiwanese semiconductor and other high-tech industries to boost investment in the United States?
In Taiwan, you have kind of a very good ecosystem where normally the semiconductor companies are, and where they can use the network. So I think we spoke before in the US, it's really a challenge for them because of the various reasons what we discussed in the beginning. A tax incentive alone, I'm not sure if this is really bringing companies there. If there are more, let's say, like restrictions and sanctions on where products need to be produced, I think this is more like where companies are getting forced to build up like new outlets, and they are producing and they mix it, right? So that's what everybody tries to do right now. I believe, for example, on 2 supply chains, I think that companies need to be prepared for this, to have domestic production in the different regions in the world in order to work with customers, especially with government customers worldwide together. I don't think tax incentive is a big incentive for Taiwanese company to invest.
Okay, Dennis, so what's your take on this agreement? Do you think it's more only symbolic rather than any kind of practical significance?
Well, first of all, the symbolic significance sometimes is important too. The sending certain signals is important. It shows the important intention to the U.S. Taiwan relations. So even symbolic significance, some people may argue. I think it's important. Second of all, I agree with Marco. The tax incentive may not be strong enough. However, there's a big issue between like a double tax issue, right? They tax like in the U.S. and also Taiwan. So even if we just remove we just deal with the double tax issue, still could take off certain burden, take off remove some obstacle for companies to reconsider their investment in Taiwan or in the U.S. So I would say this new agreement or the initiative is still sending a very positive message to the U.S. Taiwan relations. Hopefully we can bring more investors to Taiwan, and it's also sending a signal mainly potentially to mainland China, to Beijing. The U.S. Taiwan relation is still strengthening.
Well, Dylan, we certainly know that China definitely will have a response to this agreement. We knew that just recently the news was about the China kind of slap the U.S. company Micron, by imposing a ban on Micron's products. So, what's your estimates or what's your assessment of this U.S.-China kind of agreement, and what kind of response might China have for the future?
So China's ban of Micron was a very calculated one. In many senses, it catches the news. It's one of the largest American companies. They have manufacturing in Taiwan, in Japan, and Singapore, and in the U.S. And so the impacts are very broad in many ways, but also at the same time, they targeted this ban very specifically because memory products can be switched out very easily, right? A memory chip from Micron is in most cases compatible with being swapped out for one from SK Hynix or Samsung, both companies in South Korea, which also have fabs in China today. So this is a very tactical move in that it catches the news, it makes everyone worried, and it warns the US, but at the same time, it doesn't cause havoc for the supply chains. And so going back to the point on symbolic moves, right? This is very important because while the agreement between the U.S. and Taiwan hasn't spurred any investment, the companies are understanding what's going on, and so they are, some companies that assemble and manufacture for American companies. In fact, they're moving their supply chain out of China. They're moving it into Taiwan, or they're moving it into Vietnam. These Taiwanese companies, not because the government told them to, but because they understand that symbolically, this is the way that the entire industry is moving forward, and to mitigate potential risk in the future, they must diversify their supply chain out of, for assembly out of China. So you see this with Wistron, you see this with Foxconn, you see this with all of the major ODM companies in Taiwan.
Okay, Marco, kind of following up the issue about China. If China were to respond to the trade agreement by imposing sanctions on Taiwan, which they already did in the past several times, what repercussions, in your perspective, might Taiwan's export sector face?
Well, if it comes to semiconductor, I mean, because the bans might be on different products. I know it's also agricultural products, other products. Then I would think that Taiwan is already trying to diversify their end customers for these products. That's my understanding, for sure, because they feel that this might come. You don't know how strong this will be, but so they are preparing to send more products to other countries like Australia, like to Japan, like to the Western world, in order not to be so much dependent anymore. But I think in regards to semiconductor, there are still quite strong ties. I mean, design houses produced at foundries in China cannot easy to move, because this is some of the legacy products where China probably will double down. So I think there it's more difficult basically to manage this.
Well, I mean, your kind of analysis is kind of contrary to some of the observation in Chinese media. They say that in terms of semiconductor connection to China, it's not as much as what some of the Chinese party media claim. I'm not sure whether maybe Dylan can.
So there have been a lot of conflicts around Taiwan and China with regards to semiconductor talent, right? It's no secret that SMIC, China's biggest foundry, has really accelerated their process technology, got to 14 nanometer, now working on 7 nanometer, through hiring many TSMC employees, right? And so this is, it is, and many of them still work in Taiwan, but most of them, moved to China. As the Taiwanese government is sort of trying to crack down on this, the question is, can China continue to catch up? Because much of the talent is coming from Taiwan, coming from Chinese people who moved to the U.S. and worked at American companies. I mean, Morris Chang moved to the U.S., worked at an American company before coming back and building TSMC. And so the real question is, can Taiwan try and stop this? Can the U.S. try and stop this from happening sort of again, right? From an entire supply chain moving to China because the skilled people moved out of the companies domestically over to China.
Right. See, that's the weakness or the loophole, if you will, of the democracy, is that we really abide by this market logic, that we don't really prohibit engineers according to their own willingness to move from one place to another. Right. However, on the other hand, if an engineer from China, maybe they will be, need to be very careful about this kind of and ban from their own country. So, Dennis, as a political scientist, what's the analysis of this interaction between markets and authoritarianism?
Well, I think China. Well, we talk about the talents move, that the brain drain issues, and we also need to take into consideration the living environment, the political system, whether people will feel comfortable living there. Right? Remember the COVID-19 period, the situation in Shanghai. Those kind of things make a lot of foreigners actually moving out of China. That's a real a living experience to a lot of people. Of course, the post-COVID period make people moving back, but still the level and the number is not as much as in the past. So that's one thing. The difference between the living environment, different between political system. I'd like to say there's a reason why China banned Taiwan's agriculture or some labor-intensive production product. Because China also need kind of the high-tech connection with Taiwan. So when they decide which kind of company or which kind of product they like to ban, it's very technical as well. So at this moment, since TSMC or the Taiwan semiconductor industry is still leading ahead, so I think China will facing this situation, China will take care of will deal with the situation, even if they'd like to, punish Taiwan or punish something, sanction Taiwan. They still will be very careful about the situation. They will manage the things carefully, which means I don't foresee, China will, dramatically stop communication, will dramatically stop the business with Taiwan. But on the other hand, we also have, Taiwan also need to be prepared, before they do something crazy.
Okay, on the last topic, really quick, we talked about the G7 summit. The recent G7 summit saw leaders express message of peace, yet consensus on China-related issues were still elusive. So while China poses clear risk to global supply chain security, the international community seems reluctant to entirely disconnect from China's economy. Like some of you already mentioned, that still there's some influence from there too. So how can Taiwan, from Taiwan's perspective, leverage its strength in the semiconductor sector and geopolitical position? Maybe this one goes to Dennis first, to navigate these challenges.
Well, realism, right? International politics is realism. International business is also realism. National interest. What's the interest? The interest go, and people will go to the place. So that's the reason why even the European country really doesn't have a very favorable feeling or attitude toward sentiment toward China, but they still learn how to manage the relations with China because they know the business still need to go on. So how Taiwan can leverage this situation? I think semiconductor is something we call in Taiwan silicon shield, right? But we cannot have only one shield. Taiwan need to have more than silicon shield. Well, Taiwan need more. Taiwan need other. Well, Taiwan actually have a lot of invisible champion, we call it. For instance, in Taichung, Albert knows better. Taiwan has a lot of advanced machinery industry, very strong, very, very, very popular around the world, and leading in the leading company, but they are unknown. But those kind of things can be other shield for Taiwan because Taiwan is important. Taiwan need to be seen, need to be known. If we have more, if Taiwan has more, then Taiwan find a way to balance or to leverage the situation. If we only count down the semiconductor, then the situation will be more difficult. But if Taiwan can, find a way to actually promote other industry, not only count one, I think that's the leverage for Taiwan.
Right, that's a great suggestion. So Marco, do you think that diversification of our business, not only focus on semiconductor, is a crucial kind of urgent need for Taiwan to think about now?
Yes, and I think there are other industry. I think bike industry is quite strong also here in Taiwan. I still believe, because of the importance of semiconductor, artificial intelligence, how everything is basically where all governments want to be kind of self-sufficient, or they want to have some finger on the supply chain. This is a very important factor, and I also feel like that, especially here in Taiwan with TSMC, they will never put, for example, the newest cutting-edge technology outside of Taiwan. They always will keep the newest technology will remain here, and then basically with a lagging of 2 years, maybe they will roll it out to other areas, so that the whole ecosystem from design houses, it's not only TSMC Foundry, it's also packaging, testing, ASE, OSE. There's a lot of companies here, IDMs, who make these relatively small island, very powerful in semiconductors. So it's a high concentration, and as I mentioned before, having these satellite manufacturing where you get more connected with the international community outside of Taiwan, I think this is, for my opinion, a very good way of protecting Taiwan and establishing also relationship outside of here to the world. You are from Europe, so I wonder, can you think of any European country, maybe medium size, kind of parallel to the situation in Taiwan, that they used to kind of focus solely on one aspect, but kind of diversify? I don't know, maybe Germany, the car country, you can say. But I think in Germany is also machineries, industry 4.0. Of course, also try to diversify, because you have now new technology, new energy vehicles, where the Americans with Tesla coming pretty strong. Also Koreans come very strong, and also the German car manufacturers need to reinvent themselves. Right? They didn't lose yet, but they need to get a strategy together, and also here semiconductor is very important. That's what Dil mentioned before, why a TSMC fab, even with legacy technology, makes totally sense in Europe, because you have NXP, you have Bosch, you have STMicron, you have a lot of companies basically there who also would utilize this, and then TSMC would learn more about these production processes. So I think it's a win-win. Delane, so your suggestion for diversification?
So diversification is very important always, right? And Taiwan having cultural influence across the world in the form of bicycles, all the way through to there's some food that's very popular from Taiwan that that people learn about. That's important for getting people to know about Taiwan. But there's the other side of the coin, which is Taiwan is a limited size population. There are only going to be a certain number of amazing engineers, and if the country diversifies too much, pulls some of these great engineers away from TSMC, does that mean that TSMC maybe can't keep up as much? Does this mean that Taiwan loses market share? That is a risk. So there's, diversification is important, but it needs to be tactical diversification, where Taiwan already has a strength and they're extending it. For example, there's an initiative in Taiwan to start working on some of the equipment, right? Almost all the equipment comes from Japan, the U.S, Netherlands, almost none of it is manufactured in Taiwan. So, but there are some kinds of equipment for manufacturing semiconductors that could be made here now, right? And so that's maybe a tactical diversification that wouldn't, pull your best engineers away from working on the industry that is effectively the most important industry and the lifeblood of the country. Yeah, that's an excellent point, because even though diversification is something that we need to think of, but also change tax cost, right? Some costs gonna be involved with that. Okay, so any other suggestion for the whole, not only semiconductor industry or just the business or the industry development in general in Taiwan? Any suggestion to Taiwan? I do have one other suggestion, which is, given Taiwan has a limited population, there is the brain drain effect, right? Taiwanese engineers go to the U.S. and do they stay or do they come back?
Right.
One of the ways that the U.S. has been able to stay ahead in so many different technologies, even beyond what their population should allow, is by bringing the best engineers from all over the world. If you're the best engineer in Taiwan, the U.S. wants you to immigrate. If you're the best engineer in any other country, in Germany, the U.S. wants you to immigrate, in South Korea, and so on and so forth. So perhaps Taiwan could try and attract some of the world's best talent. It would be difficult, but that is potentially a suggestion.
Right, Marco, really quick.
No, I basically see the talent as the most important factor when you have like a limited space and amount of people to look to get also people from outside in to make it attractive. I think this is a good idea.
Dennis?
I think I just echo both of them. I think Taiwan is an attractive place, but we just have to make it more comfortable environment for foreign talent. We live in Taiwan. A lot of people, actually foreign people, friends love Taiwan, but the situation, especially the job situation and the visa situation, is more difficult for people really move to here. So I think those are things we can change, and we can make more convenient for our foreign friends.
Next up, an interview with Peter Kurz, Chief Strategy Officer at Quantum International. Our host, Rathwine, spoke with him about progress on the U.S. Taiwan bilateral trade agreement discussions and Taiwan's economic forecast for the remainder of the year. Let's take a look.
Let's start by looking at Taiwan's overall economic performance in 2023. The economy contracted by 3.02%, and the estimated annual growth rate for this year is projected to be below 2%. During the first quarter, Taiwan's exports to China, including Hong Kong, saw a whopping decline of 30.7%. This was larger than the country's overall export growth rate of minus 19.1%. Peter, what can we read from these numbers?
Well, I think there are two key elements here. First of all, we saw a front loading of a lot of demand for electronic equipment, particularly consumer electronic equipment, during the COVID years. And so what we're seeing right now is the aftermath of that. And yet at the same time, a fairly substantial buildup of inventories for a lot of these components in anticipation of the continuation of that demand. So this is, first of all, that sort of absorption of that inventory in a still weak demand environment. Secondly, of course, in the longer term, we are beginning to see Taiwan, as is the rest of the world, beginning to decouple from China. But I don't think that would have had any impact on these numbers at this point, but it will probably be a drag going forward over the coming years.
Do you feel much of this has that any to do with the U.S.-China ongoing tensions, as we've seen with the CHIPS Act, and we've seen more in terms of tariffs and all that?
Absolutely, and many Taiwanese companies that we speak with are reflecting to us the request from their customers, which are of course international corporations, to diversify their production base away from China and away from Taiwan as well. So there's a big push to be building new facilities in Southeast Asia, India, the Western countries as well. And this is going to have an impact on Taiwan's own exports in the long run. From the standpoint of the Taiwan companies themselves, they're still in control of that flow of products. They're going to become more maybe sort of logistic managers of this more disparate manufacturing base around the world. But from the standpoint of Taiwan exports per se, and even to some extent Taiwan jobs, Taiwan tax revenues, there could be a longer term impact.
In terms of Taiwan's exports in the long run, as you mentioned, do you feel that this will actually be beneficial to Taiwan? We see impact in the short run, but what do you see in terms of long-term growth and the outlook?
Personally, I find it to be a positive trend. And we've seen actually Japan go through a similar pattern whereby because of both political pressure from other countries to reduce their trade surplus, but also because of their own domestic demographic trends, that they've been forced to, again, diversify their own production base outside of Japan. And so they actually now have in place policies to produce where you're selling as much as possible. And it's allowed them to maintain their market share, to maintain a more flexible production and distribution channel and avoid some of the transportation bottlenecks that we are facing even today. And I think Taiwan's going to be going down that same path as well. That will also help develop more of a domestic demand market here, which will allow other new industries to emerge. And I think also to improve the standard of living in the country as well.
For our international audience, can you talk a bit about where Taiwan's exports are? And you talked about with Japan to produce where they're actually selling. What about Taiwan? What markets are there in terms of outside of China?
Well, in terms of products, obviously we're talking primarily about electronics. I believe semiconductors still account for more than 40% of our exports. And those semiconductors, of course, are also going into the supply chain for making, obviously, mostly consumer electronics goods that, again, are mostly controlled by Taiwan companies as well. Although most of those factories, again, are in either China or now elsewhere. The export markets themselves around the world, again, obviously, the U.S. is by far the largest single market. But
so that would be producing in the U.S., as we've seen with TSMC in Arizona.
Well, exactly. I mean, there is now that move among the larger companies primarily to go actually onshore in the U.S., as you mentioned, TSMC. Obviously, Foxconn has a facility there still in progress. And other companies, I'm sure, will have to follow along with them to be their sort of ecosystem and supply chain too. But they're also looking at Mexico, not to mention, of course, as I said, the other markets elsewhere in the region, Southeast Asia, India, are also big areas of focus.
We've seen Foxconn expanding in Thailand and India.
India as well, exactly.
And as a global financial expert, which industries do you feel Taiwan has potential in?
Well, it's kind of interesting. I've always said that Taiwan's been suffering to some extent from the Dutch disease scenario where...
What about for first quarter 2023?
Okay. Well, look, the industries that are performing relatively well now, among them are still the healthcare sector, not outside of course, electronics altogether. The electronics sector is going to continue to suffer from the inventory overhang and slack demand that we talked about. There are also smaller industries that are emerging too, not well represented in the listed share market though. And so again, what we're seeing is where some of these older industries have matured, again, the electronics industry in particular, or are moving offshore, it's allowing some of these other industries to emerge. But again, anything with scale and among the listed share market, I would say healthcare really still stands out among them.
We talked a bit about TSMC. I wanted to bring you back to TSMC in terms of Warren Buffett. We saw him dump shares of TSMC. What do you think's behind that?
Well, he himself says it's the geopolitical risks, which I find somewhat intriguing because these geopolitical risks existed well before he made his initial investment as well. And moreover, I think the geopolitical risks are to some extent diminishing at this point, certainly again compared to when he originally made his investment. I've pointed out many times that during these periods of rising cross-strait tensions, Taiwan has in the past proven to be a very good market to invest in because it creates a somewhat depressed valuation environment that usually pretty quickly resolves into a rebound in share prices. And indeed, we are seeing that taking place at this very point.
A good market to invest in indeed. Do you feel other global investors share that view with Warren Buffett in terms of the geopolitical risk?
Absolutely. And I don't blame them. I mean, you read the newspapers, or if you are a manager of a large investment fund and you were to take a large position in Taiwan, it would be somewhat even irresponsible. Now, I don't feel the risks are as high as what the international media is making it out to be. Or what many of these investors themselves have expressed. But for them to first take a more conservative stance is only natural. But again, I do expect that with the passage of time, that issue will be resolved. We obviously have to get through the presidential elections here in Taiwan in January and see what happens then and what the aftermath of that is as well. So we're not totally out of the woods as yet, but I am still relatively optimistic.
The Taiwan and the U.S. are aiming to sign a bilateral trade agreement. It could open up markets between two countries and take away tariffs and also address other issues that are non-related. What do you think a U.S. Taiwan BTA could do in terms of helping Taiwan's economy?
Well, I think as far as reducing tariffs, it's not going to be addressing that issue in the short term. I think it's more about rationalizing and integrating the Taiwan supply chains with the U.S. market itself.
So it's a part of a larger decoupling trend.
I would say that will be an outgrowth of it for sure. And it does, of course, allow for future tariff reductions at some point. But I think more importantly, it also provides cover for other countries to now begin discussions with Taiwan. I think many of them were waiting for this U.S. Taiwan BTA to be signed before they stick their neck out and begin the same process. So I think we will beginning to see Taiwan get reintegrated into the global trade environments at a time when the WTO itself has been somewhat emasculated and so many other countries were establishing bilateral or multilateral free trade agreements that excluded Taiwan. So Taiwan's advantage of having been in WTO has actually been diminishing over the years, and I think now we can begin reversing that process.
Not just bilateral, but if we talk about multilateral, do you feel that if this is successfully passed and signed, will this increase Taiwan's chances in the CPTPP?
Oh, absolutely. Of course, it will. And I think the U.S. has been very aggressive in trying to, they need to get membership themselves first, but also to support Taiwan's membership application too. And I think, again, having this agreement, you're quite right, Ralph, will help facilitate that process. Again, it just takes a bit of that political risk out of the way for the organization to take that step.
Liz Truss was in Taiwan earlier. She talked about the need for the UK to support Taiwan's membership. Do you feel with the UK, or if it does come on board, will that help Taiwan's membership case?
Yeah, for sure. Look, the UK is, of course, now its own sort of trade bloc, and certainly a very influential player even in the European environment too. So I suspect that that will be helpful, having both the US and the UK. Now, the two are often sort of combined together, and so it's not a sign of greater diversity of support, but certainly it does add to that.
Yeah, do you feel that pressure from China could actually hamper some of the other member countries to encourage Taiwan to join?
Well, of course, China will be attempting to put pressure on other countries to do so, but the momentum right now is to stand up against that pressure among many of these countries.
So you do feel there's hope?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. I'm actually fairly confident it will happen.
We invite you to share your thoughts and comments on our YouTube channel, and remember to subscribe for future updates. Thank you for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.